this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
In this episode of the World War II podcast, I'm joined by Clare Mulley to uncover the extraordinary story of Elżbieta Zawacka, known by her codename Zo, a woman who defied the odds as a resistance fighter, courier and special operations agent during the Second World War. Zo was the only woman to make the perilous journey from Warsaw to London as an emissary of the Polish Home Army. After completing training in Britain, she became the only female agent to parachute into Nazi-occupied Poland. There, with the Gestapo hunting her and her family arrested, she played a crucial role in the resistance fighting in the Warsaw Uprising and working toward Poland's liberation. After the war, despite being one of Poland's most decorated female soldiers, the Soviet-backed communist regime imprisoned Zo, and her story was buried for decades. Now, thanks to new archival research and exclusive interviews, Clare brings Zo's remarkable life back into the spotlight in her excellent book, Agent Zo. Clare, thanks for joining me. So we're going to be talking about Elżbieta Zawacka, who will become Agent Zo. Shall we start with the background? She's Polish, but her first language was German. So what was her background?
So she is born in 1909 in a historic Polish town called Toruń in northwest Poland. But in 1909, when she was born, that part of Poland had actually been annexed into the Prussian Empire, which is an earlier German empire. So legally, when she's actually born German. But her very patriotic parents make sure she knows damn well that inside she is Polish. It's a fascinating start to her life because the Prussians are very keen to clear the culture and the history of Poland from the area, sort of like cultural cleansing, if you like. So her family are required to speak German. So her first language is German. Elżbieta herself, Elżbieta is obviously the Polish version of Elizabeth, but when she's a child, she has to use the German form. So she's Lisa or Liesel. Is certainly in public anyhow. And it's only when she's 11 years old at the end of the First World War that Poland regains its freedom and is put back onto the map of Europe. One of her formative memories is seeing her father, a big man, a veteran himself, with tears running down his cheeks because he has heard the national anthem for the first time played openly on the streets of Poland in their hometown. And this is, hugely informative of this young girl who she's the seventh of 8 children. She's had to fight for a bit of attention. And here she shares something with her father. And she kind of swears to herself that she's going to fight both for Poland's freedom, but also for her own freedom to be Elżbieta, her own name, and to speak her own language. I
never thought of fighting for her own name in her own, as opposed to the German version. Yeah,
the German version of it. That's right. One of the great ironies is, of course, that the Prussian Empire, in forcing her to speak German from a child and have a different name in public, what they've done is given her the perfect legend as a special agent. She speaks fluent German and she's had a double identity since knee high. She knows how to manage that. It's quite ironic, really.
She joins the Women's Military Training Organisation, the PWK. Is that a branch of the military? She does that in the 30s, doesn't she? 1930s.
She joins when she's at university. It's not officially part of the Polish Armed Forces. Tens of thousands of women served in the Polish Armed Forces, but largely not in combatant roles, or at least that's what there was expected of them. So they were drivers, they were, secretaries, translators and so on. Similar, actually, in the British at the same period, women could not be armed in the British Armed Forces. And in Britain, what you get is the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, which is a uniformed and military trained organisation outside of the British Armed Forces. So their acronym is the Fanny, and they were used by the British Army, for SOE, because they could be armed legally and serve Britain. And so Elżbieta joins a sort of equivalent organisation in Poland. They are not part of the Polish military legally or officially, but they are very highly trained. They're armed. I mean, Zoe learns to drive a military vehicle. She could drive an ambulance. She drives a tank for a brief moment in the war. She absolutely loves it. There's lots of lovely photos of her riding a horse and lying on her belly doing target practice, shooting weapons. So she's highly trained and they're uniformed, but they're outside of the official military structures. But they're deployed.
Is it a voluntary organisation or a paid organisation?
It's voluntary. I mean, she is a senior instructor, so I think she gets some recompense, but essentially it's a voluntary organisation.
Right, I wasn't sure quite where it stood or if it's sort of a halfway house territorial army kind of organisation. It was
they are civilians. They are legally civilians who are stepping up. But of course, one of her great achievements in the Second World War is she secures for the first time the legal recognition of women in the Home Army. So that's Poland's resistance army, as opposed to their armed forces overseas. They have one of the largest and most highly organised resistance movements in underground state. Towards the end of the war, Zoe manages to secure the legal rights of women as soldiers in the Polish Home Army, a recognised allied army at that point, which actually saves many, many thousands of lives, because until that point, when the Germans were taking female fighters as prisoner, they'd either just shoot them immediately or they'd send them for probably quite brutal interrogation and then send them to be worked to death or, labour to death in a camp, or just sent them to an extermination camp. So these women weren't surviving. They were being treated as commandos under Hitler's commando order because they didn't have military status. One of the most important things, her getting legal military status, is it gives the women rank. It means they can discipline people in the armed forces and so on. And it attracts more women to serve as well, of course, because they get recognition, but they also get protections. The Geneva Convention was set up to look at the protection of prisoners of war. And of course, it was just assumed that all prisoners of war would be the military, would therefore be men. And so women didn't have any protections under the Geneva Convention unless they were specifically recognised as legal soldiers. So it's actually at the end of the Warsaw Uprising that she manages to get this put through as a legal decree and accepted in law. And, the Warsaw Uprising Museum estimates around 12,000 women served in the Warsaw Uprising with the Home Army. And so it's the only time in history that Germany sets up prisoner of war camps for women. Nazi Germany does. And so instead of being executed, she saves thousands of lives.
It's remarkable that there's a piece of paper that they do and suddenly say, oh, in that case, you're not a partisan. We're happy to put you into a prison camp.
Well, it's all more complicated than that, of course. I mean, at this point, the end of the Warsaw Uprising, it's October 1944. And I mean, Nazi Germany knows it's losing the war. Anyone with sense knows they're losing, and they're being pushed right back now. We've had D-Day, so we've got Western forces on continental Europe. We've got the Red Army pushing right through Poland now, and everyone is pushing them back to Germany. And so this is it's a little bit of saying, look, we are legitimate. We played within the rules of law. It just gives them, they believe, they hope perhaps it gives them that sort of level of respectability, but I don't think it does.
So the PWK, when the Germans invade, was Zoe activated for the defence of Poland?
Yes, so she's actually one of the very first women to serve in the Second World War. She's actually woken at 5 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of September, 1939. She's staying at an air base in Poland and she hears a series of explosions. This is the Luftwaffe coming over, destroying the Polish airfields as much as they could very early on. It was preemptory strikes. And this is what wakes her up. And she turns on the radio, which confirms that this is what we would now call the Blitzkrieg. This is the start of the Second World War. They've been invaded. And so she gets into her uniform and she has orders to undertake in the event of enemy invasion. And so, of course, she's immediately into action.
It's remarkable them suddenly jumping into action like that and finding roles for them to place them in.
This wasn't sort of spontaneously done. I mean, they are pre-planned. So she has orders to undertake, certain routes. So she commandeers with her unit of women. They commandeer a municipal bus. They scatter shards of glass and nails and things on certain roads, hoping that it will slow down the German advance on certain routes. And then she picks up various orders as they travel on. And she's deployed in Lvov, which is, of course, now Lviv in Ukraine, but was then Lvov in eastern Poland.
So when the Soviets invade...
17 days later, yeah.
She's now in the Soviet sector.
Well, when they invade, it's Poland, okay? I think it's often forgotten that Poland did put up a good defence in the first couple of weeks of the war. But when the Red Army invades from the east, they realise they can't continue to fight on effectively on two fronts. And so on their own at this point. So they take the strategic military decision to evacuate their armed forces. They get out around 35,000 troops. They get out their government. They get out quite a large part of the treasury, some of their great art treasures as well. The first Enigma code breakers, Marian Rejewski and so on, they get out. And they get out through Lvov. So part of Zoe's role is to help keep that route open. One of the people who got out through that route was actually Colin Gubbins, who was with the British military, who was just in Poland at that time. And he then later wrote about seeing women pulling up paving stabs to help make the barricades to keep that route open. And one of those women, of course, would have been Zoe. He didn't know her then. He knew her later in the war when she made it to Britain, 1943. But so that's her role at that point. And then the Soviets come in and they say that Stalin justifies it by saying, or tries to justify it by saying that this is to protect the ethnic Russian population in eastern Polish territory, and that, this is a spontaneous act because Poland is in chaos, basically. But of course, we now know that it was prearranged. They had part of a secret protocol, part of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, that was to divide up Polish territory between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and that's what they do.
So how the PWK viewed by the Soviets? Are they viewed as combatants, or are they able as women to slip away?
Most of the women do slip away. I mean, quite a lot of them go out with the Polish forces, those 35,000 troops, and will later serve in admin roles and as drivers. Some of these drivers, we've got stories of female drivers serving at Monte Cassino, bringing the shells up the mountain, serving under fire. So this is not to be sniffed at. I mean, they go out and they play significant roles. But Zoe and many of the others, hide their uniforms, change into civilian clothes. And Zoe manages with great danger to get across from the Soviet-held zone into the became known as general government, but the German-held zone, and gets to Warsaw and immediately volunteers with the fledgling Polish resistance, which will become the Home Army.
Well, I'm intrigued by because we say the Home Army, the fledgling resistance. It's big, isn't it? It's organised right from the start, though, isn't it? It's
very highly organised. Poland has this extraordinary underground state. So they have this organisation. They've got their government, which has got out through Lvov, through that route into Romania with the armed forces and so on, into France. The government sends up in Angers, and then after the fall of France, June in 1940, they move out to Britain. And so then they're set up in London. So they've got the Polish government in exile in London, but they've got all of the structures inside occupied Poland as an underground state. And that includes law courts. It includes a university, a school structure. Zoe also teaches secretly when she can as well, because she is a brilliant academic as well. And they've got this massive resistance armed forces, so the Polish Home Army.
She takes on the nom de guerre of Zoe at this point, doesn't she? Where's the Zoe come from as a name? Where's she drawing that from?
Yeah, it's short for Zosia or Zofia, which is the name of a couple of her friends. One was her sister-in-law. It's these two women who she was very emotionally close to, who she kind of held in her heart. And what she's doing is paying homage to them by taking their name. Zoe's brother had been in the Polish army before the war, and unfortunately, he had died of pneumonia. His heart had been weakened during a period of famine in the First World War, and he had sadly passed away. And his wife, Zofia, had been at his bedside, and then she collected his personal effects and started walking out. And then the hospital staff heard a gunshot from the toilets, and she had taken her life with his service weapon. She couldn't bear the idea of living without him. And Zoe was honouring the woman who had felt so strongly about the man she also loved, her brother. So that was one of them. And the other one was a very close friend of hers from the PWK who had unfortunately been killed in a train crash just before the war. And so always believed that was because of German sabotage. And so she had loved both these women very dearly. And she's always very much, I'm not a hero. It's a collaborative effort. All these women were serving together. We need to remember all their stories. And so what she's doing is keeping two women with her. This is what motivates her and powers her on. This is a collective effort. All the women should be remembered.
She goes on to run a resistance circuit, but after that, which I thought was more interesting, because I could picture what a resistance circuit might be in my head. but she becomes a courier. This involves her going from Poland to, is it Berlin?
Yes, she goes.
It's remarkable.
Yeah, it is. I mean, she's already a courier. She sets up this women's intelligence network. Every week she condenses all the information and she keeps most of it in her head. But obviously these are weekly changing statistics on troop movements and so on. And so she has a little aid memoir on a slip of paper. And at first they're hidden, inside the back of a clothes brush. We've still actually, amazingly, we've got her clothes brush. I've seen it. The back just slides out and she could put a slip of paper in. I love it. And then soon they were very organised and they were doing microfilming. So then you can hide microfilm in places like the shaft of a key she used. The one she liked best was a little brass cigarette lighter. And you could use it to light a cigarette, but it wouldn't destroy the microfilm inside. Very clever. But they use all sorts of places. And she has a lot of experience of smuggling this information across wartime borders early on, just in former Polish territory. But then the resistance realised that she has, perfect, fluent German, and she's blonde and blue-eyed. And certainly after France falls, they can't continue to use that land route that they'd been using earlier through a chain of couriers like her. They have to find another way to get this information very rapidly out to London, because a lot of it's time-sensitive military information. One of their key routes is to send someone, in this case Zoe, on this incredibly perilous journey with some microfilm right into the heart of the Third Reich, into Berlin itself, because they have a contact at the then Manchurian embassy and he can get it in the diplomatic post to London. That's the fastest way to get this stuff out. So she is put on the most dangerous route of all.
At that point, she's running on false papers. They give her...
Yeah, that's right. Forged papers. I mean, initially she's working on stolen papers called fingers because they didn't have photos. It was just fingerprints. But by this point, by the time she's going into Berlin, yes, she's travelling largely as an oil company secretary, a German oil company secretary. She's meant to be. Obviously, oil is a more important industry. So that would explain why a woman, could have in wartime the reason to be travelling around. We've got quite a few photographs of her from her different papers, and it's wonderful when you put them all in a line. There she is. She's changing her appearance, of course, a fringe, not a fringe, and different clothes, glasses on and off, all that sort of thing. So, yeah.
She eventually does become compromised. How does that affect the courier work? Does it mean that does it not? Because she's she's got a nom de guerre and she's undercover anyway. But when they know who you are, how does that affect the courier work? Does that just send it to the ground? There's
twice where she had to lie low in a convent during the Second World War for a while, to let things blow over a bit. There's so many times where she's nearly caught. And we won't do the danger and the drama. It's all in the book, folks. Just to leap from a moving train in the middle of the night. I mean, she's terrified. She's terrified of heights anyhow. I mean, one of the things I love about her is that she's quite vulnerable. She's not like this tank herself. I mean, she's scared of heights and she has to jump out of a plane. I mean, she has to face, that's real courage. She has to face her fears and she presses on anyhow. And she's often quite funny about it as well. I mean, she's saying, I was sweating like a mouse. I'm thinking, do I sweat? I don't know. But, so she flushes. She's got this towel as well. So she's on train when they're doing checks. She'll be fanning herself, hoping it looks like she's just menopausal. I love the fact that menopause comes into this story. She's nervous, but she just presses on.
It's all those bits in the book where it suddenly feels like a black and white noir film with her being followed. Or am I being followed? I don't know if I'm being followed. So I'll throw them off and change trains. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I know. And I would love it if someone could make this into a film, or a Netflix series. There's so many sort of episodes to it. It's an extraordinary life. So, yeah.
The thing with this story is it just gets more unreal. This is where truth is stranger than fiction. If she then has to get out. They ask her to courier a message to London?
She has to, yeah. So she is basically burnt on some of the routes she's been using previously, but she's a really experienced courier. So it's a remarkable moment in the war where they make her the emissary of the commander-in-chief of the Polish Home Army. So that's the resistance army. And an emissary means she's his personal representative. And she's sent with 2 very important microfilm. And so that's thousands and thousands of pages. And she's sent with 2 missions to undertake in London. So she has to cross, it's almost 1,000 miles of Nazi German occupied territory all across Europe. And it's an extraordinary journey. And we probably don't want to go through it all now, but she gets thrown out of a high hotel window at one point. She nearly gets drowned while she's hiding in the water tender of a steam train. She is shot at in the freezing mountain passes of the Pyrenees, but she bloody makes it.
It's remarkable. It's the crossing of the Pyrenees that I thought was impressive, because I know that there is certain escapee prisoners of war who don't manage to get across the Pyrenees. I have a funny feeling one prisoner of war shoots himself in despair over trying to get over, and she buggers on.
Yeah, she has to make 3 attempts with a guide, obviously, to take her, show her the routes. And is nearly caught. There is one section where there's a bullets literally whizzing past her, but she manages to hide. So, yeah, and just keep her nerve.
How did you find London when she arrived? Because London must have been very odd when you've come from this high stress situation of Europe where you're looking over your shoulder all the time. And I know when she arrived in Britain, we're still at war. Britain's still at war. There's still the air raids, but it must have been a very odd experience suddenly walking down the street in London.
Yeah, it's a very different experience, and she has to acclimatise a little bit. She's one of the things that she notices is that she can hear all these different languages being spoken on the street. She hears French because there's French soldiers over here. There's obviously British and American accents as well. There's all sorts, and Poles. And she's like, wow, I mean, this is impossible where she's come from. And some policeman smiles at her and she's like, oh, what? These people are arresting me and just doing random, raffles on the streets, rounds ups, and then executing people. It's an extraordinary thing. And actually, it's a little bit problematic because one of her missions is to help sort out the London end of the courier routes, this land-based courier routes. It's run by men from London, and it's a great chap. I love Rum. Rum's his codename. Casimir Zbilski. He picked his favourite drink for his codename. So her codename, her nom de guerre is Zoe. His is Rum, and he's just got a great turn of phrase as our Rum. He's a handsome chap. He's quite arrogant, and he finds her a bit prickly, a bit difficult. So he decides to seduce her at one point. He thinks this will help, sort things out, But he says, her response was astounding. What he does is he suddenly flourishes a pair of silk stockings at her in the middle of St. James's Park, and she's just shocked, partly because the only women wearing silk stockings in Nazi German occupied Poland are wives of German officers or the mistresses of the Gestapo. Had she have gone back and not known this and warned them, it would have been a tell. She'd have been picked up for smuggling if she's lucky, probably worse. And she realises that they've just got no idea of what conditions are like in occupied territory. He's a very brave man. He'd served in the September 39 campaign and again in the defence of France, but he hasn't experienced the occupation. Basically, they're clocking off at 5 o'clock on a Friday and not starting work till 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, as if that's how it's working everywhere. And so she sets them straight, and massive improvements to the efficiency of the courier lines, of course.
It's a strange disconnect, isn't it, when you're in London trying to organise underground operations in a foreign country and you don't necessarily understand directly the threats that those people are involved.
No, they have no experience. They hadn't investigated, they hadn't considered. Her teams are working around the clock. Every delay for a courier, say 24-hour delay to wait for a return message, is putting their life in peril every second of that day. They've just got no kind of concept of that. I mean, she talks about how she doesn't blame them. It's just that the irony is that she's the soldier with the experience of occupation, but she arrives in a skirt and a shirt, and they call her a captain in a skirt. They can't really take her seriously because she's a woman. Yet she's the actual soldier, and they're all in uniform, but they're sitting behind a desk in London. Very different experience. I mean, Rum and Zoe become very good mates, actually. They do fix the courier system and they end up serving together in the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. So there's a lot of respect there, but it is, there's work to be done, and she does it.
Now, for her to get to the Warsaw Uprising, she has to return to Poland. Did she choose to return to Poland, or was she ordered back? Because presumably she could have stayed in London. Yeah,
no, they do actually say to her, thank you, you've been great. You've been as good as any fella. Would you like a flat in London, or, how can we sort you out for the rest of the war? And she's, what are you talking about? I've got to go back and serve. And they said, well, you can't, because there's only one way back at this point in the war, and that's the parachute. And obviously you're a lady. So next slide, she's jumping out doing her parachute training. Yeah, she insisted she had to get some trousers. Yeah, it's not her favourite part of the war, actually, because, as I said, she's terrified of heights and she sprains her ankles. But she presses on, and she becomes the only female member of the Polish elite special forces who are trained in British country houses. And there's some wonderful stuff about her training some of these guys in what to expect behind enemy lines, back in Poland, in occupied Poland, because they haven't experienced it. So, what's rationed, how to respond to different German uniforms, so on, because they didn't know. And then she parachutes back herself in September 1943. She's the only woman to parachute from Britain to Nazi-occupied Poland.
It never occurred to me. I just assumed that until you made it explicit, I sort of thought it was a mixture of Lysander's landing and people jumping.
They didn't say Lizzie's, Lysanders, they did. And they also brought stuff back. So their rum is sent in later after Zoe. He's sent in the next year in a Lysander. And they send the Lysander really not to take him. He's just a convenient passenger, might as well go, but to collect parts of a V1 bomb that the Polish resistance have hidden. And they have their engineers and scientists have done a lot of work with it. And they are sending back samples of the fuel, key parts of the engine and the gyroscope and so on, sending that back by air. So Rum manages to hitch a lift, but Zoe is parachuted back, leaping from a 4-engine Halifax bomber.
When does she go back? That's
September 43. Yeah.
So we're still a long way off from the Warsaw Uprising. So what's she doing? Because her cover's now blown. She's returned to Poland, but her cover's now blown.
I mean, there's a number of betrayals. So by the time she gets back, she spent some time in Britain. That threat has gone. They've kind of moved on from that. So she continues working with the courier routes, doing that work with her friend Emilia Malessa. But quite soon there is another security leak. She calls it not a leak, but a deluge. And a lot of the unit are arrested. I mean, they're working in cells. So there is obviously as much security put in place as possible. But once they arrest a few and then they start, there's horrific accounts that we have of the brutal interrogations, which is obviously beating, starvation, cold, but also the use, they tie the women to a bed and they run electricity through them through their most sensitive areas. And, it's very hard to not talk under such brutal so there's a big security leak, and that Zoe actually and Emilia both managed to get away, and there are some warnings issued, but at that point that's one of the times that Zoe has to lie low for a while in the Shimonov convent.
I hadn't realised actually how big the cells were. They're 40, 50 people, aren't they, these Polish cells?
Well, the cells aren't, the units are, but there are smaller groups within them of, 6 people. So, yeah. Imagine an IRA, sort of. But
well, I've had visions of very super hyper small cells, probably based on Hollywood films of France.
Yeah, I mean, Zoe is different. Zoe is one of the senior people here, so she knows a lot of the people in a lot of the cells, a lot of the linchpin in each cell. But most cells, they don't know anyone at all. They just,
I can't remember quite the timeline for this. Is she in the convent as the Soviets are closing on Warsaw? Does she come out of and return to Warsaw for the uprising?
She does. So she is under orders to remain, because they know that the Germans have worked out that this is the same woman and they've got her details. And at this point, Zoe's entire family have actually been arrested. Her younger sister, Clara, is in Ravensbrück. Her brother, Egon, has been sent to Auschwitz. Her cousin, Leonard's been sent to Auschwitz. He's one of the very few to escape, actually, which is a remarkable story that's in the book. So, yeah, her parents have been arrested as well. So she thinks like, well, I've got nothing to lose here. I need to serve. So it's one of the few times she defies orders, and she leaves the convent and hitches her way up to Warsaw to make sure she takes part in the Warsaw Uprising. And she actually plays quite an important strategic role there.
Well, I was going to say, what role are they doing in the uprising? Because it's a sizable, it's 40 to 50,000 people.
Yeah, it's big. It's very strategically organised. Poland wanted to liberate its own country. The German occupation has been horrifically brutal. Hans Frank in the GG zone, the General Government Zone in the middle, so that the western part of Poland had been incorporated into the Third Reich. Then there's the occupied part, the general government, and then there's what was the Soviet-held part. But Germany at this point has taken the lot, obviously, and been pushing east. And now we've had D-Day, so we have German troops coming. They're not in Poland yet, but they've got forward movement in Italy. So as soon as they get Brindisi and Bari, they can send supply from aircraft from there. These are sent by the RAF, but the pilots are from all over. So you have Brits, you have a lot of Poles. The Polish pilots, of course, had served. So effectively in the Battle of Britain now want to play their role to support their own capital city and their uprising. South African pilots and so on. They're coming in incredibly brave. They're flying low to drop canisters with supplies, mainly guns and ammunition, weaponry, a bit of other stuff as well. But they're flying low so they don't smash these containers, even if they're on parachutes. So they're flying right into the teeth of anti-aircraft fire, and the attrition rate is appalling. Several times it said we can't send any more because, we send out 7 and 1 comes back. But the Poles particularly, I mean, they even write to the Queen, to the King, they're saying, look, we must keep fighting, we must serve, and they continue. So from the Poles' perspective in Warsaw, they are fighting to push back this incredibly brutal occupying force. And they cannot wait. They are desperate. They've had to hold themselves back for the right moment so long. So they are keen to get the fight honourably out into the open. And they wear red and white armbands as their uniforms to serve in the open. But politically, they are also very aware that the Red Army is coming down from the east. In June 1941, Hitler took the ludicrous decision to invade Soviet-held territory. Everything had been a victory up to that point, so he was going to press on east. Therefore, at that point, he betrayed his former ally, Stalin. Stalin couldn't really believe it. He was astounded. It took him a while, it really knocked him to realise. And then he comes back with force. They, of course, join the Allies, which was fantastic in terms of the resources that the Allies had. Now Germany has to fight on two fronts. Now Germany is on the back foot. But for the Poles, the first of the Allies, this is a country, the Soviet Union, that had invaded them alongside Nazi Germany in 1939. Now they're told they're their allies. And they know that the Soviet Union is very acquisitive, very aggressive towards them and wants their land. And yet they have to welcome them coming through Poland to reach Germany. So what they want to do is to liberate Warsaw so they can welcome them as equals and as allies and not be beholden to them for their liberation. They want to have won that fight themselves. So that's the concept. The Red Army actually reach the outskirts of Warsaw and they just set up camp. The Poles had felt it would be possible to liberate. Well, they hoped within 2 days, but they thought they would get rid of the Germans within 2 weeks. With the support flown in from the Western Allies. But Stalin just makes it as difficult as possible. He won't let the Allied planes refuel on the far side of Warsaw in the land that they now hold. So they have to take twice the petrol. They can't take as many supplies. And when his forces arrive, they encamp. They don't come on to help. So basically, it's up to the Poles to try and fight it out as much as possible with the Germans. And eventually, they hold on. It's incredibly heroic, but incredibly tragic as well. They hold on for 2 months, and the death toll, both of the soldiers, but also of the civilians hiding in the cellars and basements, is absolutely appalling. And eventually they are forced to capitulate, at which point, Hitler says just completely destroy the city. I mean, it's virtually destroyed already, but then they just demolish any property, any building that's left. And it's at this point that Zoe gets the women recognised, the female fighters, as soldiers legally. And so thousands of them are put in. They actually made 2 prisoner of war camps for women alone, because there were so many female fighters that one camp couldn't hold them. And then the Germans retreat because, they've just been doing this from spite. They know they can't hold that territory. And then the Soviets come in and claim that they have liberated Poland. And they did liberate much of Poland, I should say. But
Zoe's in Vienna when the Russians occupied. How did she get to Vienna?
Well, I mean, Zoe gets out with last orders. Many of the women go to the prisoner of war camp. Zoe, of course, could have done that herself with her head held very high for the service that she's undertaken during the war. But she is going to fight to the end. And she's actually given the last orders from the commander-in-chief of the Home Army, who at this point is Bor Komorowski. He himself surrenders. I mean, he's a very well-known figure. He gets sent to Colditz Castle, actually. But she has got last orders and she keeps fighting to the end.
Claire, we're going to pause there. Loyal listener, we'll be back in a moment. I mean, she does have a post-war life, but I'm intrigued by how did you come by the story, because it's not a story that just abruptly ends.
Basically, she keeps fighting because Poland is left with a Soviet-imposed communist regime. So that part of Poland that she'd initially served in the war, Lvov, is sectioned off to become part of the Soviet Union at that point. And obviously a bit of Western Poland is gained. I mean, Eastern Germany becomes Polish territory. But it's a very brutal communist regime imposed on the country. And they go hunting the resistance fighters because they think that these are the people who might lead resistance against the Soviet-backed communist regime. And Zoe herself, I mean, one of the great ironies of her story is that she's a hair's breadth from being caught on multiple times by the Germans, but she's actually only arrested by the Polish communist government. The Polish government in exile remains in London throughout the entire communist period, with the the honours of state and everything, but they are no longer recognised by the Allies. The Allies recognise the communist regime inside Poland. And eventually Zoe is picked up and she's sentenced under pretty much trumped up charges. She's sentenced to 10 years in prison. And she's tortured, actually, but she survives. She gets out early after Stalin's death. There's a bit of a thawing and so on. She gets out early, but they make damn sure her story is not told. And in fact, nearly all the stories of the women are kept hidden. And the whole war narrative is rewritten, of course, into the narrative of the Great Patriotic War, the Russian version, the Russian narrative of the war, which starts in 1941 when they're invaded. You know, they kind of don't start with the earlier stuff when they're allied to the enemy. So her story was deliberately kept hidden. And I heard about her from a veteran of the Warsaw Uprising, a woman called Hanna Czarnocka. She had served as a 16-year-old in the Warsaw Uprising, and she had known Zoe. And I met a couple of other veterans, another wonderful woman called Marlena Szebel, who had also served in the uprising as a scout, who had got out through the sewers underneath the city, managed to get out with a number of fighters. So these women told me her story and how remarkable she was. And I just thought they were incredible. And they were like, we're nothing. I mean, Zoe's the real hero. So I'll have to find out a bit more. So off I went. And when she's in London, she's here for 3 months doing those 2 missions she had to undertake. She's known as Elizabeth Watson, and there's papers in the National Archives that relate to her there. SOE proposed her for an OBE at that point and so on. There's some great stuff. And in the Polish archives in London as well. But most of her papers are in the Polish National Archives and various other archives in Poland, including this fabulous archive run by her cousin, her niece, really, that's their relationship, in Torun, her hometown. Because after the war, Zoe thought, well, why aren't they telling the women's stories? And why aren't they telling the stories of the people from my region? And so she interviewed all the surviving veterans that she could secretly. And then she's a brilliant academic and she correlates it all and she tries to sort of pinpoint, well, that, maybe that could be corroborated by these people. And she draws up this account. And when the Poles, the communist government, they don't quite realize what she's doing, but they know something that they don't like is going on. And they set up a surveillance thing. They call it Historian. And that they arrest her again in 1976. And they try and arrest her again another time. So, but she's got away. So, it's extraordinary.
You do pose the question at the end of the book, why does no one in Britain know about the greatest Polish female resistance fighter? And I think you probably rephrase that, why does people in Britain know very little about Poland during the war? But I'm intrigued by how well known is she in Poland now? Because presumably she wasn't at the time.
Not as well known as I think she deserves, and hopefully we're going to be changing that. She's known in Torun, in her hometown, very well. We went there on Halloween, All Saints' Eve there, and they lay candles. It's really beautiful if you go to a graveyard that night because everyone's remembering their families and there's candles everywhere. It's just glittering beauty. And around Zoe's grave, there were thousands, which was so lovely to see. And there's a mural painted to her there on the side of her communist era apartment block, which was painted after she died. They've opened a big bridge across the river there, which is the Zawacka Bridge. So that's all great. But across the rest of Poland, not as much as she should. I mean, she is mentioned in the World War II Museum and the Warsaw Uprising Museum, of course, both of which were very helpful during my research. But she's not well known. I spoke at a conference for the Polish, it's the IPN, it's the National Archives of Poland. I spoke at their conference last year, and there was a young group of female cadets, and there was about 30 of them. So I thought, well, they female cadets, they'll have heard of her, and none of them are heard. They were like, what are you talking about? She's the only second female general in Polish history. She died a general, which is fantastic. But yeah, her story's not that well known. And the book is now being translated into Polish. So I'm going out in October for the launch and doing a bit of a tour. So I hope that it will, begin to trigger a bit more wider knowledge.
This is what I've said right before we started, that, it's really fascinating to see how that history is weaponized and then changed once the Cold War is over and it slowly starts to change. So it'll be interesting how the process changes over time. I
think that's a big reevaluation. I mean, when I go with translators to archives in Poland and we pull out documents, and even now, if the translator is my age-ish, they're going, well, this is not the story that we were taught in school. This is fascinating. This is not the history that I've been told, So there is massive work doing a reevaluation of that history. But I mean, we all have to reevaluate history. I hate it when I hear you can't retell history or you can't. Yeah. Of course we need to. We constantly need to, because we find new information, we find new archives and materials that challenge what we knew, but also because we look from a new perspective. We look with fresh eyes. So from both of those reasons, we need to be reassessing the past. History is not the past. The past is the past. History is our understanding of the past, and that is always being revised rightly. And the other thing is over here, we're still, so many times people said to me, you're writing another World War II, but we've got all the stories. We know all that. Well, hang on. What about all these women that served, And even today, I think we do know that there were female special agents, but their stories tend to be told very romantically. After my book on Christina Skarbek came out, she was sort of more recognised widely, and she was included in a book when each chapter was a different Second World War story. And they did a whole chapter on Christina, which is great. They acknowledged my book. That's all fine. Wonderful. But they opened it saying, we are attracted to Christina because of her beautiful smile. You just think, well, actually, she subverted an entire German garrison on her own. What about that? So we still need to be better at telling these stories about the achievements of the women and how significant they were, and other marginalised stories as well.
Yeah, well, you said marginalised stories. I was sat there right at the start thinking, we never hear about how those tens of thousands of Poles got out through Romania. It just put the Pole in British history, and Poland went to war and Poland fell. How did they all end up in Britain? There's thousands of the Polish army. We just hand-waved away. I mean, and there's other extraordinary stories, because obviously when the Soviets came in, they arrested and detained thousands and thousands of Polish soldiers, many of whom, unfortunately, they murdered. They would say executed, or they would say they didn't do it. But also there were still thousands in gulags doing labour and in prison. And when they joined the Allies in 1941, there was a pardon. I don't know what they were meant to be pardoned for, but anyhow, and an amnesty. And these guys came out under General Anders. And at first they didn't have shoes, and they became another Polish armed forces, the Anders army, as it's colloquially known. And the role they played at, Monte Cassino and elsewhere. And then you got all the Polish pilots in the Battle of Britain. And I mean, I've written Second World War history. I've written about German women. I've written about 2 Polish women. I've written in various different theatres. I'm not obsessed with a Polish story, but it is one of those that hasn't really been given its due. Claire, it's been a pleasure talking with you. As I said before, Zoe's story on how history can be written with an agenda, as happened during the Cold War, is something every history undergraduate should perhaps read as a case study in our understanding of the past can shift over time. Thank you. Loyal listener, we've only just scratched the surface of Elżbieta Zawacka's incredible story. If you want the full picture, I can highly recommend picking up a copy of Agent Zoe. I'll put a link on the website and in the show notes. Now, if you'd like to enhance your World War II experience, why not consider becoming a patron by joining the Patreon community at patreon.com/WW2 Podcast. You'll get access to advert-free episodes, allowing you to fully immerse yourself in each conversation. Your support helps keep the podcast running and growing, ensuring I can continue to bring you more World War II content. So if you're ready for an uninterrupted listening experience, head over to patreon.com/WW2 Podcast. Well, that is it for this episode. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town and blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.